So, very interesting and I think relevant topic for discussion this evening is this, I guess, Islam and modernity, debunking common myths and misconceptions is the title of the discussion. What's interesting about that is, since the inception of Islam, you can say that there's been a corresponding corpus of mythology, or misconception might be another synonym that we can use in our conversation this evening. And the production of misconceptions and mythology. Let me tell you briefly about myself, to put all of this in context, and maybe it's relevant and it's not. And I should probably say at the outset that I'm not a faqih, or a mujtahid, or an imam of any kind, so I don't have any uniquely Islamic training in branches of fiqh or the sharia or any of the Islamic sciences. So thankfully when the brothers had arranged for me to address you this evening, they didn't pick anything in that realm. I'm a barrister by trade, legal academic, particularly in international law. And some of this is of interest to me in the legal sphere because there's a separate production of mythology. And a lot of this does center on law, and I'm going to make this point shortly. But again, as I say, when we talk about misconceptions, when we talk about myth, and particularly the production of myth, we see that this isn't a modern phenomenon, but it's actually quite an old phenomenon. Some might even use the term to a certain extent ancient. When I say ancient, of course, what I'm talking about is about 1400 years since the inception of Islam. And there are reasons for the building of these myths, these misconceptions, and we're going to have a conversation about why. Is this something that is inadvertent? Is it based out of ignorance? Or is it produced actively? And what are the agendas then of actively and deliberately, and in a calculated manner, producing such myths, such misconceptions? I thought that some of you might know this. Basic myths or misconceptions, probably not really helpful. I think a lot of you are probably Muslim, or if you're not Muslim, you attend a university. So obviously I don't have to sit here and tell you, oh, did you know that, Allah is not a separate God, a separate ilah from the God of the Bible, of the Injil, of the Torah. You all probably know this already, so in a sense that goes without saying. I probably don't have to tell you that Allah is not a moon god, so again, a myth that's very popular at a lower level maybe. So the very basic garden variety type of misconception and mythology I don't want to address this evening. We're looking at something which is a little bit more sophisticated, at least in its trajectory and its evolution. So, let's talk about the myths early on. And you can say that from the time of the message of Islam, there is a certain misconception already. And you find this in the seerah. There's this idea that, why does Islam come? What is the message of Islam? It's deemed a threat to the people of the time in Mecca. So, from the very beginnings of the message, the Prophet ﷺ had to deal with misconceptions. So, after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, as Islam begins to spread equally, the Muslims come into contact with non-Muslims. And there is, of course, misconception. Often a lot of these misconceptions would come to places where Islam didn't really have any sort of contact with. So, one of the things that is peddled historically is the fact that Islam came to conquer by the sword. And of course, we know that that's not true, and there's a lot of literature in this area, George Saliba and others. So for instance, when the Muslims enter Syria in the time of Umar bin Khattab, so the second of the Khulafa Rashidun, there's this impression that Islam has come to conquer. And one of the first acts that the Muslims carry out in Syria is they approach the church of St. John the Baptist, which was a church that was used by the Christian community. So Muslims come and they pray their first Jummah Salah in this church. And the very next Sunday, so 2 days later, the Christians are carrying out service in the very same church. And this goes on for several hundred years. This sense of coexistence. Over time, as the Muslim population increases in Syria, they buy the church from the Christian community. So you'll notice that there is no act of pillage or conquest taking place, but the misconceptions and the myths are beginning at this time. One of the commonalities between the misconceptions at this particular era and if we want to call them racisms or prejudices, and this is where Islamophobia early on and anti-Semitism have something in common, in the sense that the fear in relation to anti-Semitism was not one based in race, for example. It was based on religion. It was predicated on religion. So Christians would level charges of deicide to the Jews, that you killed Isa alayhi salam, as though such a thing were possible in the Islamic tradition. But similarly, we have a fear which is based religiously, ideologically, in this early era. So one of the things that's happening is, again, and Edward Said has written a very interesting book, and he writes in about 1980, in a book called Covering Islam, which has two meanings. One is covering in the sense of reporting, and the other is covering in the sense of covering up, so to obfuscate the truth of something. And he says that what's clear at this time is Islam seems to be, in a lot of ways, in its ideology, more similar to Christianity than anything else at the time. So the prejudices, the misconceptions, are being produced because of competition. So if you look at this almost from a capitalist sense of thinking, it's the Muslims have opened up shop, the Christians have opened up shop somewhere else, and we're competing. We're competing for adherence. We're competing for converts or reverts, depending on the terminology that you use. So for a very long time, the misconceptions, the myths that are peddled, are in relation to the ideology. And so the next big step in the production of myth, in the production of misconception, happens during the First Crusades. So this coexistence that I talked about is very briefly halted in a sense. So the Fatimid Caliph, Khilafa, at the time, a man by the name of Abdul Hakam, who was the Sultan. A lot of scholars refer to him, at least in the West, as the Mad Caliph. So there's a sense that he was clinically insane or something. And what he does is he burns down the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is very sacred to Christians at the time. So what happens is this gives the narrative what it wanted, the sense that Islam was barbaric, the sense that Islam was bent on conquering and destroying. And so the Pope gives a series of speeches. And he says, now is the time to liberate the lands of your Eastern brethren from the barbarian horde. And now he's referring to the Muslims in Jerusalem, influence. And he says, no less an authority than Christ commands this. And so we have the beginning of the First Crusades. And so you have a mythology which is being built already about the reality of what one would expect when they enter Muslim lands. When the Crusaders do end up in Jerusalem, they find, of course, the situation very different. For example, there is a flourishing civilization in Muslim lands. Soap is a Muslim invention. Who knew? So the Crusaders are coming into contact with soap. They're coming into contact with industry, with textiles, with science. And in fact, to this day, if you look at frescoes, paintings from this era, from Florence and elsewhere in Italy, paintings of the Virgin Mary, Maryam, alayhi salam, you will notice on a lot of the cloths, the hijab that Maryam wears, you'll discreetly see the kalima in the cloth. Now these are Christian artists painting this. And you see in a very subtle sense what people would describe as an Islamic coding. And the reason for that was the Muslims were so successful with textiles that the Christians, first thing they would do, if you wanted a garment to cloth the bones of your saints, if you were a Christian, then you had to, your only option was a Muslim loom, a Muslim loomer. So the Christians come and they see not only science, they see not only literature, revolutions in hygiene, as I mentioned so. One of the other things they see is a sophisticated legal system. So the Crusaders, as some of you know, they needed a way, when they're going off to fight the Crusades, to separate in their property ownership from benefit. So they said, I want to leave this property to my son. I don't know if I'm going to come back. How do I go about making sure my son or my family gets my property, and that that property is for the benefit of my wife, my daughters, my cousins, or my business, for example? And at the time, communities in Europe didn't have an answer for this problem. When they begin the Crusades, they find that Muslims had several in fiqh. And we know this now in English law as a trust, what we say in Arabic, a waqf, a trust system. And so I don't know if Loughborough has a law school. No? Okay. So no way of really confirming this, I guess, here anyways. You're going to have to go to Leicester to confirm it. Any legal textbook on equity and trust, chapter 1 usually starts with the Muslim or the Islamic origins of trust law. Interestingly enough, we can trace the first big myth, if we want to describe this as the ancient myth, or a myth attaching or owning to religious competition. It's actually of this era. So the Crusaders come back, and there's suspicion because the Crusaders come back very wealthy men, partly as a result of this new trust system that they got from the Islamic world. And there's suspicion by the Pope. These men are rich, they're powerful, something needs to be done, but they're seen as the defenders of Christianity at the time. They're seen as the Mujahideen of the Christian world. How do you demonize the Mujahideen, your protectors, the ones that are protecting the pilgrims? So they come up with an interesting idea. They accuse the Crusaders, particularly the Templar Knights, as worshippers of an idol. Everyone has probably seen at some point in art or elsewhere a depiction of the shaitan. You know, horns, tail, hooves for feet. You've all familiar with this image? Yes? This actually comes from this period. And this idol the Pope called Baphomet. Now you'll notice that if you look at the spelling of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Middle English, it's usually rendered as M-A-H-O-M-A-T. Muhammad is how it would be spelled, transliterated. Now you notice the similarity in the names. Baphomet, Muhammad, or Mahomet, they would say in English. This is the first major myth. That the Muslims, first of all, worshipped a man, that the religion was inherently demonic, and that you had now these infiltrators who had come back from the East and are now infecting the West. I don't know if this sounds familiar to any of you, a little bit. So we'll see that very hard to distinguish, sometimes, the ancient from the modern. And so the Templars are burnt en masse at the stake. Their last leader, Jacques de Molay, refers to testify against his brothers, is executed for worshipping this idol, which there's a code among the Christian clergy that basically what the Templars had done is they had accepted Islam. This is how the myth begins taking place. But what is Islam at the time? It's a satanic faith that worships a man that is largely, and to a certain extent, the Antichrist. So this, in the 11th century to the year 1315, is the first myth. So the solution for the Christian world is Christianity. They are seeking believers, the Muslims are seeking to spread the truth, as it were, direct competition. So for a long time, this was the nature of the myth. We move further 200 years, Martin Luther and the Reformation, which leads to Protestantism. At the same time, you had in the 1500s and the 1600s, as Islam is spreading commercially somewhat, trade routes are still established despite the antagonism. A man by the name of Isaac Newton, who I'm sure all of you have heard of. I hear that Loughborough has a very strong engineering program, physics. Isaac Newton, very famous man, lays the foundation for what we know to be modern physics. Most of it anyways. Isaac Newton was a Unitarian, which means that he didn't believe, though he's nominally a Christian, he didn't believe that there's this concept of the Trinity. He didn't believe that Jesus, Isa alayhi salam, was a man. He believed in the oneness of Allah, if you can believe that. Isaac Newton. And so the Protestants said, this man, he's a Mohammedan, which is, as we know, the term used to a certain extent disparagingly for a Muslim. Why? Because he rejects the doctrine of the Trinity. So you notice a pattern that at this point in time, the myth making is centered around what Islam is and what Islam is not as a religious ideology, but in relation to and directly to be compared with Christianity. The more that it apparently is distinct from Christianity, the more it's a problem in Christian Europe. And really that is the nature of the myth-making. Never mind the fact that, of course, the Muslims in the room know this already. We don't worship the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We revere him as the final, the seal of all the prophets. But that is where the reverence ends. So we do not make the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam divine. But in the Christian mind, this is not entirely grasped yet. So the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is seen as the Antichrist in the literal sense of the word. In the sense that the Son of God, so to speak, being worshipped by the Christian world, and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the Eastern world, being worshipped in a similar way, and so you have an antithesis. What's interesting, I think, for us now, is we move into the colonial period, and this is where the misconceptions and the myth-making become more relevant for our day-to-day lives, and we can plug this into the political realities that we read about, that we encounter, that we debate and discuss. And this happens with colonialism. So, one of the things that we have today is, generally speaking, Islamophobia appears to be a problem among those on the right, in the right wing, who are particularly intense in their bigotry, to a certain extent regressive, and you have this idea of liberalism, or liberal ideology, which portrays right-wing politics, right-wing Islamophobia, as being, again, particularly vicious and virulent in its aim and its bigotry. But we're going to see in a minute that these two things, these two ideologies actually share a common ideological root. We're going to approach this in just a second. So with colonialism, what we have is something that's referred to as, in French, la mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. And so whether you're right-leaning or left-leaning, there's a sense that Europe has the responsibility of civilizing the rest of the world. And they're concerned with two types of people. The first is these, if you're looking at this from a liberal perspective, you're concerned with illiberal societies. If you look at this from the right, you're concerned with backward societies, those that are savages, do not have civilization yet. And one of the chief aims of colonialism is this idea of Orientalism. I want to ask you in the audience, how many of you, show of hands, have you ever heard this word Orientalism before? Show of hands. Okay, so about half of you. So for some of you, this is unique, so I'm going to explain this term. Orientalism originates in the 19th century with colonialism, and it's this idea that the Orient, or the East, constitutes a unit of study. So the entire Eastern world, whether it's China, India, the Middle East, the Maghreb, North Africa, it's all one big monolithic single area. And we need to study this place because we're colonizing it. Of course, it is speaking as the Westerner. But we have to understand it through Western eyes. This is part of Orientalism, to understand the Orient through Western eyes. And this is what isn't said with a view of proving the superiority of Western civilization. Now, it's interesting, Gandhi in the 1930s was asked, "What do you think of Western civilization?" And Gandhi responds, "I think it would be a good idea." So this notion that there really wasn't a Western civilization. When we look at Orientalism then, what it's concerned with is proving the superiority, and this is the key aim, of Western civilization. So for someone who's a colonist, if you're a colonial officer from Great Britain, one of the things that you're trying to do is you're trying to produce knowledge, and you're trying to convince not only your fellow colonial officers, not only the people back home in England or France or Italy or wherever, the Dutch, but also the people that you're interacting with, that we know more than you do about yourself, about your own identity, and we're going to tell you what that is. So it's called knowledge production. You're creating a concept, an idea, however true or false it is, to the person in the East. Now, one of these concepts is that barbarism, savagery. So when we look at Islam, we see one of the first myths, that Islam is inherently a violent religion. And this actually comes from colonialism, Orientalism. This notion that, why does this myth come up? What gives them the impression? Is it something from the Quran? Is it traditions from the Sunnah? No, not necessarily. What it is, first of all, looking back at history, particularly the Ottoman Empire by this point in time, we have a rival empire. So the British are not the only kids on the block, so to speak, in the imperial sense. But we have an empire which has a certain Muslim or Islamic ethos. We also know at this point in time that that empire came very close to entering Europe. So we have Mehmet, who is the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, who comes to the gates of Vienna. So he had this revolutionary way of fighting wars, so cannons, things like that. The cannons get bogged down in the mud before he conquers Vienna. Very close to Europe. So there's a certain fear. Now, of course, one of the first reactions connected to this, and here's where the two start getting connected, is that the Ottomans were conquering in relation to scripture, in relation to things that they read, and this created a uniquely violent faith-based group. And they connect this to, and this is not surprising, resistance. So when a foreigner occupies land, one of the first reactions is to resist. So you can imagine the British going into India, attempting to go into Afghanistan, the French going into Syria and other places. The reaction almost instantly is one of resistance. Not necessarily for any religious reason, but Robespierre, who's French revolutionary, says that the very first reaction of any people is to resist occupiers. Nobody likes our missionaries, he says. So when you go into a land to conquer, they're going to react, they're going to resist. This gets built into this idea that Islam is inherently violent because they're taking a look at the Muslims and they strip it away from a colonial context. Second myth is this idea that originates at this time. The Muslim relationship with women, the other. And this is a big focus of Orientalism, is always to look at oneself in relation to the other. How do Muslims treat women? Now, for many of you, you already know that by the time Muslim or Islam comes, it does something revolutionary in that it gives, especially spiritually, equal rights in that sense to women. Women are able to inherit for the first time. This was a concept alien at the time to anybody else, to any other community. This is alien. But what happens is the Orientalists, when they come into the Eastern world, again, they look at the two major empires at the time, the Ottomans and the Safavids, and they have this concept of the harem, as they call it, deriving from the term haram, which means sanctuary or something sacred. And they noticed that sultans were always around women, or this is the impression. What it actually was is a haram or a harem, in this sense, was simply a place where a public figure, such as a vizier or a sultan, was not on display. So if you break down the day into a 24-hour period, a sultan was always acting in some public capacity for about 16 of those hours. For about 8 hours, you know, it's like your living room, I suppose would be the analogy. You know, you take off your shoes, you turn on the TV, or you pull up with a book. You don't want to study, you don't want to talk about work, you don't want to be on display. You want your own time to disengage from what's going on around you. There's nothing inherently sexual about it, incidentally. And so a lot of scholars will say that this is the origin of the second myth, is this obsession with the notion that a Muslim woman is oppressed, needs to be freed. But interestingly enough, the Orientalist is always focused more on this notion of, later on, sexual liberation, something pertaining to hedonism. And they think that the Muslim woman is oppressed, covered up, and is just waiting to do any number of things, only if the Westerner can come to her rescue. And so the second myth, a lot of the times you see this peddled today, again, it comes from Orientalism. Now, one of the things that happens is Orientalism becomes unfashionable for a very long time. But what it does is it produces experts. They're not real experts. Oftentimes they're pseudo-experts, they're fake experts. So in the colonial era, what you would do is you would designate a number of individuals, and you would say, okay, these are scholars on Islam. These are scholars on the Arabs, the Indians, the Afghans, the Uyghurs in China. And nobody was really able at the time to question this expertise. It's just you had something that an expert would tell you and you would accept it. Now what happens? If we look at this today, and let's try and look at this analysis today, ever since, in particular, the war on terrorism. Very interesting book come out recently by Harvard scholar named Lisa Stemnitsky called Disciplining Terror, the Invention of Terrorism by Experts. And so one of the things that begins to happen, in academia especially, is you have the emergence of experts that are interested in studying Islam, not necessarily objectively. And so, for example, Edward Said says that there hasn't been an honest discussion about Islam since the Enlightenment. It's called Islam as News. So when you talk to somebody, for example, on the streets, in a coffee shop, their interface, their interaction with Islam is only based on what they read in the newspaper, snippets, headlines, captions. So we're taking a look at oil prices, these days dropping. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, rising. Why is it rising? They look at Saudi Arabia. They're instantly wondering what's happening in Saudi Arabia. They make a connection to Islam. That's the reason. 1979, shortly after Edward Said is actually writing. He's saying, well, the average person is reading this in the newspaper. It's termed an Islamic revolution. Again, something must be connected to Islam. No discussion about the doctrines, the tenets, the ideology, the philosophical accretions of Islam itself, but it's Islam as tidbits of news, as headlines, as captions, bylines. So this creates a problem, and it actually aids in the myth-making. But academia begins to structure itself in a certain way the moment that this idea of Islamic fundamentalism begins to rise in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And Islamic studies is divided into two areas. One is everything that's happening before the 1100s, and very artificial distinction, by the way, and everything else that's being studied before that. So everything being studied, after that, I should say. So before the 1100s, those that were undertaking Islamic studies were discussing things such as philology, grammar, scripture, exegesis, which is the manner in which you interpret scripture, for someone who isn't interested already in, for example, the deen, this is kind of boring. And so the establishment isn't really concerned with that. That happens, and those academics are put off to one side and they can continue with their studies. But you then have something else happening, which is everything after the 1100s. These are the very interesting political discussions that take place. And that's worrisome. And so, in the eyes of the establishment, so what happens is, particularly in the United States, and to a certain extent in the United Kingdom, young scholars are given certain scholarships. They're told, if you continue your work on this, you're going to have all of your expenses paid, on the condition that when it's finished, it becomes subject to policy considerations. So there's something of a coercion that's happening. So for example, I write something on Islam in the 1950s, let's say. It becomes relevant for ideological reasons. I'm told I have to limit the extent to which I can talk about this. So a lot of, in addition to the myth making, we have something else that's happening, which is myth dispelling. And myth dispelling is stopped at this very critical core level. And so the question is why? Why does Islam occupy something unique, a unique position in the eyes of the Orientalist? And the answer to that is yes. And so, chiefly, there are three reasons why Islam is seen as being unique, uniquely interesting in the eyes of the Orientalist. The first reason is, as I said before, its similarity in some ways to Christianity. So Islam claims that it is the same religion of Isa alayhi salam, of Musa alayhi salam. So the revelation is the same. So it's a continuation of the message brought by Jesus, peace be upon him, the message brought by Moses, the message brought by Abraham, peace be upon them all. This creates a problem for a lot of people at the time, particularly for the Orientalists. Second reason, Islam, for a very long time, had an empire which spread and occupied, at a certain point in time, most of the known world, with a few exceptions, with obviously Western Europe as being the chief distinct exception to that, and of course the New World, North America, South America, etc. Because of that, again, it's seen in a competitive sense. The third reason, the sheer numbers of the Muslims. So you have this sense that there's about 1.5 billion Muslims, give or take, these days. Before that, I mean, the numbers were always large. At any given time, this very large population presents a threat to a different ideology. And so for those reasons, Islam is seen not as a distant threat. So there's the sense that the two other great civilizations of the era, the Chinese and the Indian civilization, the Indus civilization, had been conquered and it was distant. There's some sort of residual impact, and of course all of you are a testament to that, or most of you anyways, that it's not distant. It's very close to home, as the expression goes. And so for the Orientalist, these three reasons are the primary concerns. And so Islam is still, to a certain extent, seen as a threat. Now if we look at things that have happened since 9/11, has this discourse been renewed? In a lot of ways, it absolutely has. And the Orientalist playbook has been resurrected. I'm going to give you some examples. So during the War on Terror, leading up to the war in Afghanistan, there were two wars taking place at the same time. One was against the Taliban, the other was against Al-Qaeda, in the eyes of the United States and Great Britain, etc. One of the things that they determine is, now the Taliban, because they are in de facto control of the territory, they are therefore seen as entitled to prisoner of war status under the Geneva Conventions. So the United States decides, well, Afghanistan is a failed state. They can't reciprocate under the Geneva Conventions, so it doesn't apply. They don't have the requisite capacity to reciprocate with us that same treaty, so it doesn't apply. In the 1900s, there were two different ways of fighting a war as far as the laws of armed conflict were concerned. If you were fighting Europeans, you applied things like the Hague Regulations, the St. Petersburg Agreements. All of these laws only apply to Europeans because the savage, the people living in the East, didn't have the ability to apply those same rules to the European. And so you had these things, for example, called dum-dum bullets. I don't know if some of you have heard of these. So they're bullets that explode when you shoot them at somebody, and they were banned, except when you fought someone from Africa or the Middle East, someone that was a savage. Because they couldn't apply the rules, you had to do what you could to kill. So the war on terror takes this idea of the savage, and it calls it now the unlawful combatant. Same thing, exact same concept. So the unlawful combatant is someone who doesn't follow the rules of war, who can't reciprocate, and so you need something exceptional. They're different, they're apart. We don't understand why, we don't understand the psychology, we know it's barbaric. So you see again this myth number one. Why are they unique? They're fundamentalists, they're radical. Now this is an idea that comes in 1992. So after the Cold War, you have this idea of clash of civilizations, which some of you have heard. Samuel Huntington writes an article called The Clash of Civilizations. And the reason why he writes it, he's a Cold War analyst, he's very quickly unemployed, right? Cold War's over, need a new enemy. So the next ideology is Islam. What is Islam a threat to? Capitalism. Or free market, unadulterated capitalism anyways. The idea of there being no regulation, the idea that you can sell anything and everything, no regulation, no rules, no parameters. So Islam at this point is presented as a threat. Again, they start peddling that first myth of the Orientalist, which is one of unique violence. Never mind at the same time, you have, for example, settlers in Israel, motivated by religion. A group called Gush Emunim in 1980, the exact same time of the revolution in Iran, justifying illegal settlements under the guise of religion. But that's ignored. The reason why it's ignored is because Western civilization is defined as a Judeo-Christian civilization, not an Islamic one. Islam is the other, remember. So, again, resurrecting this myth. Second myth, again, coming from the 19th century, is an obsession with the Muslim woman as being the subject of oppression. So, for example, you've all heard this word honor killing, yes? And when you think about it, what is honor killing? It's this idea that a woman, by engaging in unlawful sexual behavior or unlawful, for lack of a better way of describing it, something which pushes a boundary in relation to genders, gender relations. And that somehow casts aspersions on a family member, whether it's a husband, father, etc. Now, when you really think about it, think about domestic violence. What is domestic violence motivated by? So, the non-Muslim, when he, for example, is physically violent towards his spouse, his daughter, whether it's out of jealousy, whether it's out of suspicion, it's the exact same concept. The concept isn't different. And I think in this country alone, there's about 2 murders motivated by some sort of masculine honor every day. But the Orientalist, always obsessed with the Muslim woman, not being able to understand, why does she dress like this? Not really different in a lot of ways. A woman that wears a hijab, really different from a nun? No, not particularly. Never mind that, for example, in a place like Ireland, convents were places that you sent unwed mothers. It was a form of punishment. But the idea that they were oppressed didn't happen. Because in the West, we think we understand Christianity anyway. So we know that the reality is that the nun isn't oppressed. But that logic doesn't apply to the Muslim woman. And now, we all understand that, but a lot of times we don't understand why. Is it an accident? Is it deliberate? Again, the obsession comes and you can attach this back, you can tie this back to this 19th century idea of Orientalism. Two great myths of it. And so, this notion of, as you know, terrorism as a concept, as distinct from violence of another kind. Not an Islamic concept. European Union says that, for the most part, in 2010 alone, out of over 1,200 foiled terrorist plots, you know how many you could tie back to someone claiming that their motivation was Islam? 12. Out of 1,200. So, vast majority of these instances are separatist movements or some other form of political violence. So, why peddle this? Again, this notion of competition, competing spheres. And in a sense, this is where right-wing Islamophobia and left-wing Islamophobia, in a sense, have a common philosophical and historical tradition. One sees it, the only difference is motivation. So one sees a narrative of liberation, well, we have to free these people from Islam. The other, the right-wing version, isn't particularly interested in that. It sees simply an Islamic society as being particularly vile, and that there is no rationale, there is no solution. There doesn't need to be a solution. The solution is, simply speaking, the West. Whereas, on its proper opposite number, advances this notion of liberation, of emancipation. Emancipation from what? Emancipation from some sort of anachronistic philosophy, worldview, etc. So, one would normally ask, well, what do we then do to overcome this myth-making, the preconceptions, etc.? At a very basic level, what one can do, and what is already doing, I suppose, particularly, for example, the Islamic society here. The first solution is to have the argument, have the conversation, but to a certain extent, to contextualize the conversation. So when we're talking about, for example, political violence, we offer the explanation that political violence is political violence. It's not religious violence. And that seems common sense, but you'd be surprised. So, contextualization is one of the most important ways of countering the narrative, right? Countering the myth-making, I should say. Second thing that needs to be done, and this is in a sense connected to the first, is to reject the premise of the question you're being asked. So, consider the debates. Consider the phraseology, consider the premises of the debates, and look to see where they're loaded. So for example, a very common example of a loaded question, I ask the brother in front of me, I say, well, brother, how many times a week do you beat your wife? This is only 2, you know. So you notice the question implies something, doesn't it? It implies that he already does. Now I'm simply asking him, now he answers the question, he plays my game, he plays along. So, understanding the premises of the discussion, very important. I think one big one, to use examples in current events. All of you are familiar with what happened recently in France, right? Charlie Hebdo, all of that. So, how is the debate depicted, framed, couched? It's one of what? Free speech, right? Freedom of expression versus a society that doesn't believe in any of those things. Now you notice it's very easy to fall into this trap and say, well, on one level, Islam doesn't allow freedom of speech, why are you guys falling for this trap? You tell them we don't believe in freedom of speech. You know? And of course that falls for the question. The first question is, do we have freedom of speech, really? You know, for example, in the United Kingdom, or in France, or elsewhere? The response is no. Such a thing doesn't really exist. And the extent to which it does, it's always connected to ideological baggage. So, if we were to have an honest conversation about it, well, we would probably tell somebody who advances this idea, if one wants to call it the French model, we'd probably say, look, where we disagree is actually the dividing lines. So there's a principle of fiqh, which some of you might be familiar with. Something which is not explicitly forbidden, for the most part, is allowed, right? That which is not explicitly haram is halal. So on the drive back to the train station, if myself and the brother who drives me there, we're talking about mobile phones. He's telling me, oh, 2015, there's about 10 new mobile phones coming out. Let's say that he's a big fan of gadgets. It's not a forbidden conversation to have. I mean, we might not be talking about the Quranic basis for mobile phones and the fiqh of mobile phones and how it pertains to the rights of visitation of brothers. By the way, there's books written on this, the fiqh of mobile phones. Really interesting if you ever get a chance. But it's this idea that, is that conversation forbidden? So a lot of people that don't really know much about Islam will think, if these guys aren't talking about the Quran and the Sunnah, then what they're doing is haram. So they're going to tell you, look, freedom of speech is horrible. It's where do we draw the dividing lines? And so we reject the premise that there's actually such a thing. And it doesn't actually take very long to figure that out in the West, that there's not such a thing as freedom of speech. And the very easy example to use is, of course, things like Holocaust and all of that. We don't have to use that very, sensitive whenever you bring up this example. But there are a number of other things that you can do. So, for example, as I'm talking, I turn on this microphone and I start shouting, "There's a fire!" and you run out. There's no fire. Freedom of speech? Can I shout fire in a crowded theater? No, there's a problem. Right? I'm not inciting racial hatred by shouting fire. But that might be a justifiable reason to limit it, right? So, likewise, the society determines values. And how it determines values is not so much arbitrary, but it's certainly not objective. The reason why is you cannot connect it to something such as science or technology. The science can't tell you what your values are. I study engineering, okay, how much should I love my mother? Don't know, right? Doesn't really tell me, it's not aimed at that. So, how does a society determine its values, right? Again, questioning the premise of the question also means challenging the assumptions of the question. So, if one is values, for instance, and apparently the Pope agreed with this, by the way, if you're offended by certain depictions of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, of course you have the right to be offended. I mean, freedom of speech you would think would dictate that you have the right to be offended. But notice that whether it's the Danish cartoons or the French cartoons, something that happens before you get to drawing cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And usually that is debating immigration. So these cartoons, more often than not, are not independent, standalone satires, but they're often connected to a marginalizing, a maligning of the other. Again, which is also linked to an Orientalist discourse, a threat from within. This idea that the enemy is different from you. He looks like you, he talks like you might talk with a McDonald's accent like me, right? Or might have your British accent, for example. It's a problem. It's called othering. And it's often connected to this. So understand, of course, like I said, not only the context, but understand the premises underlying the question. That allows you to dispel myth from fact. Third thing, very important, we have to know our history. Not just our own history. For example, I'm sure that there are a lot of brothers and sisters in the room, very good, I'm sure, with Sirah, very good with in their knowledge of the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. How much do we know about, for example, the Enlightenment? How much do we know about European history? In for example, the Dark Ages. Now you're told that these are called the Dark Ages. Why? What period are the Dark Ages? About the year 600 to about the year 1066. Nothing's really happening in Europe. Is nothing happening in the world? Like, did the world stop spinning? No. Right? Of course, now when you look at the Islamic world, there's a lot happening. So the Abbasids in the 800s had this very interesting society whereby every person who was a subject of that particular empire received a stipend, a salary, simply by virtue of being a citizen. So everybody had money. Everyone was given a salary. Now, if there was talk about a certain person being virtuous. So I say, the brother here is known for always telling the truth. Never tells a lie. I mean, it's common knowledge, let's say. His salary goes up. Or you say, this brother, if you leave something valuable on the table, no one ever steals it. He's always responsible for finding the owner. Salary goes up. The budget of translation, 4 times cancer research today. In the 800s. SubhanAllah. The scholar earned as much as the movie star earns today, if we adjust it. So when you look at how society was operating in the Dark Ages, it wasn't actually dark at all. It was just dark for a certain corner of the globe. So knowing one's history, very important. And therefore understanding the trajectory. And you would think people who can't predict the past aren't going to do a good job predicting the future, right? So in order to make analyses, we have to understand the past. And we therefore understand where a lot of this comes from. And we're able to then have the discussion, the honest discussion. We're able to disconnect. And now we say, do you understand historically what Islamic civilization and society was? And if you do, and you can compare that with the European history, you might actually be able to undo some of this myth-making. Right? So, another valuable thing. And finally, it's to understand the political and the economic considerations that take place around these type of discussions. So, as you know, Middle East, a lot of natural resources, and so it's always been subject of geopolitical covetousness. Oil is very important, especially these days. Other natural resources, be it coffee, etc., always been important. And so when you understand that a map of the Middle East and the Muslim world, for the most part, looks like a chessboard, you're then able to disconnect things that should be disconnected from theology, for instance. So geopolitics, not really connected to theology, but when one has an understanding of this, when one has an understanding of the past and the future in relation to this, then one understands it better. So for example, it's 2015 now, 100 years since the McMahon-Hussein correspondences. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the McMahon-Hussein correspondences at all. I'm getting some heads no. Okay. 1915, the British in fighting World War I. Fighting Germany, fighting the Ottoman Empire. The British were big fans of double-dealing types of politics. They're fighting Germany, but they didn't want to fight Germany directly. I mean, it was just the British way of doing things. So they go after the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire was in the state of terminal decline by this point in time. And they said, we need to find the weak spot. That's where we need to attack. So they reach out to a man named Sharif Hussein ibn Ali, who was the Sharif of Hijaz at the time, so the two holy cities of Mecca and Medina. And they tell him, okay, you lead an insurrection against the Ottoman Empire, we'll promise you one massive Arab state, or Muslim state. And since you're from the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he's a member of Bani Hashim, said you probably have a better claim than these Turkish guys do. So we'll push that claim. So in 1916, he begins an insurrection against the Ottomans. In 1916, that same year, the British carry out a secret deal with the French known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So in that document, they say, forget what we said to Sharif Hussein, we're going to divide this region amongst ourselves. So they tell the French, you can take Syria and Lebanon. We want Iraq because of its railway, because of its port cities. We want Palestine as well. And we want Egypt, right? Port cities, railways. They wanted strategic connections, right? Getting resources across using railways, etc. 1917, the Russians, there's a revolution in Russia, some of you know this, right? The communists take over. They leak this to the Arabs. Look what these guys have been doing behind your back. So Hussein resigns, and the British say, no, don't worry. We're still committed because you Muslims historically had a civilization. You know how to create a society. Don't worry about it. We're going to make sure we live up to our promises. And of course, as you know, it never happened. Right? Never happened. But to understand history is to understand. Now, when we look at the discourse, Sykes-Picot still invoked, right? By any number of parties. Al-Qaeda would talk about it. Whether they understand it or not is a completely different conversation. But very critical to understand history. And now you can disconnect it and say, okay, some of this is political. Some of this is international relations. It's distinct from Islam. Islam is thrown into it, of course, because what is the first step, and this is sort of the last Orientalist myth, decent to pick up on, the enemy is not human. How do you dehumanize the other? Key element. If you can dehumanize the other, you make it easier to perpetrate atrocity. So, a scholar named Judith Butler says, and some of you probably, face this, and I don't know if some of you, every now and again, Russell Brand's become really popular now with, his blogging and confronting politicians. And he does say something which it smacks of being somewhat true. He says, when I see in France all these guys linking arms and walking down the street, with hashtags and all of this, he says, I find it strange that when there's a bombing in Afghanistan, he says, I really have to convince myself to care. I find it really difficult. He says, honestly, because it's distant, I don't perceive it or apprehend it the way that I do if it happens here. Paris, London on the Eurostar, you're 2 ways from Paris, two hours from Paris. You might think, I could be there next week on holiday. Yeah, that's a problem. Who's going to go to Afghanistan now, right? As tourists. Probably not a lot of people who, don't know anything about it or don't have family. So you don't perceive it as being immediate. So in order to apprehend the loss of life, you must first apprehend them as human. One of the things that the Orientalist has always done is to, again, this notion of being a savage makes you less human. Again, we're seeing this happen again more tangibly. That the vast majority of deaths and atrocities taking place in the Muslim world scarcely registers on the front pages of your daily broadsheet in this country. And this is why. It's the dehumanization. Because now you could justify anything, or at least get people not caring. And so, pointing these things out, very relevant to the conversation. Likewise, it assists in holding, for example, your own politicians here accountable. Why does nobody care that 50 people die in Afghanistan every week, or more? Why doesn't that bother anybody? What happened to this liberal claim of universalism? Every life is important. What happened to that? So, to point out double standards, very interesting. But some of these myths, obviously connected to the doctrines of Islam, most of them connected to Muslims, right? Being a Muslim. And now we have something slightly more frightening, which you're probably going to see more of, again taken from the Orientalist playbook. I'm going to close on this note, and maybe we can have our conversation slightly more fully with your involvement. It used to be that you could have some expert on the BBC, ask him a few questions about it. They're still kind of popular, Douglas Murray and others, really infuriating. And they would tell you, in their view, oh, this is the problems with Islam and Muslims, etc., etc. Now what you're seeing is it's what's called the native informant, or that's what it would be called in the colonial era. You take people that, for example, Bridget Gabrielle, who is really popular among Christian evangelicals in the United States, Christian era, talks about how she lived among the Muslims and how they're savages. Walid Shabat, same thing. So you're seeing this thing become fashionable again, known as the native informant. You pick somebody, for example, if someone says, I used to be a Muslim, I'm going to tell you everything that actually happens. I was their neighbor, I'll tell you what they do at night. Let's look at, really? So it's resurrecting this idea of the native informant. That's what we're seeing more of now. So this idea, again, Islam and modernity, debunking common myths and misconceptions. I think one of the things that we have to bear in mind, again, historically, since the beginning of Islam, this has always happened, right? Prophet ﷺ warns us, Islam will begin as something strange, it'll end as something strange. So glad tidings to the strangers, right? So something that, from its very inception, there have always been misunderstandings, misconceptions. Very few of them accidental misconceptions. But what we see is that this evolves. Or actually, maybe evolves isn't the right word, mutates, right? So it changes very subtly, still there, right? Someone's always benefiting from it. Who benefits is usually the fundamental question. And on that note, Allahu Alam, Jazakallah khairan. Thank you for your patience and your indulgence. Assalamu alaikum. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, perhaps we can have that conversation. Jazakallah khairan.
to thank the speaker, Brother Mujahid Ali, for giving a very informative talk. Now we're hoping to have almost half an hour of a Q&A session. If you have a question, please throw up your hand. Try and make it as concise as possible so that we can go through as many questions as possible. Okay, so first probably...
Zaglan, talk, bro. You know, the title is to do with debunking myths and misconceptions. My question is that, you know, at a time now where the myths are, you've gone to another level, where at the moment, every time you pick up a newspaper, there's something about Islam or a Muslim in a negative way. And also the fact that there's even now a group that's set up in the Middle East which is actually trying to show a picture of Islam in a way where it actually backs up the argument of it being backdated and barbaric and so on. So my question is that, you know, to actually do away with these misconceptions and myths, the only way possible would be is if a true example of Islam was there for everyone to see in its application. Up until then, it would be very difficult to do this. If you can just elaborate on this one, please.
Okay. Just to understand the question. So, this depiction, even in the Middle East, of Islam as being something backwards, and this idea that if there's an example of what Islam would actually look like, for example, or the example of what Islam actually is, would that be helpful? And I think that, again, if we look historically, that's absolutely true, right? So let's go back just to prove this point in history. So in Egypt, at the time of Omar bin Khattab, you had two groups of Christians fighting, the Monophysites and the Coptics. And whenever each gained power, the other would persecute the other. Now, Islam came, Islam was established. People realized that there's this deen of Islam which is coming, and now it's coming into Egypt. You can imagine that a lot of the people in Egypt weren't particularly excited about the prospect of that. But what was the message of Islam at the time? So when the Muslims came, they said, okay, neither one is going to persecute the other. You know, so when they established, the rule of Islam in Egypt, for instance, the very first thing, among the very first things that was conducted was, okay, establishing things like the protection on minorities, things like this. So if you were to look at, for instance, Islam as a system, and what that system advances in terms of its economics, political philosophy, diplomacy, etc., etc., I think we do need to think at this level. And when we do present it, I think, yeah, there is a very good chance that people will realize, or that at least serves as the example. So, let's take a look at, if we were to look at this argument of being backward, regressive, etc., in the West, because this happens in the West equally as in the East. So, let's look at the recession, right, the 2008 recession. Now, if you present, what would Islamic economics say about this, for example? Does anybody know? Right, so first we have to understand, let's say, what the 2008 recession was based on. So you had mortgage-backed securities, yes? So you had a company, a bank, that had, let's say, 3 or 4 mortgages. They're making money on these mortgages. They attach these 4 mortgages and they sell it to an investor. And because there's nothing backing that mortgage, it's going to collapse. Now, if someone comes and says, look, from an Islamic economic perspective, here are the reasons why you don't do that. Number one, in Islam, money is not a commodity, right? Money is a means of transaction. It is not a commodity. The idea that it's a commodity, first of all, leads to greed, avarice, etc., etc. It actually inhibits trade. So if you advance, for example, in the economic sphere, to just use that example, people would probably not see it as regressive at all. They'd probably see it as revolutionary, right? So you say, okay, here's how Islamic investments work, right? Here's how stocks, debentures, etc., Islamically work. Very sophisticated models. How does Islamic transfer happen financially, hawaladat, etc., etc. Now, we know what that is. Western Union basically implements. So, the example of what Islam is, when presented properly, and I think this is sort of your point, absolutely. And historically, is this the case? For the most part, it was, right? For example, Ibn Taymiyyah, to quote him, he would say Islam does not advance through the sword, it advances through proofs and evidence, fundamentally. So is that not true today, right? Does Islam, must it continue to advance through proofs, evidence, hujjat wal burhan? Of course. So what is required for the carrier of dawah is to be acquainted with this, right? To speak in that manner and to familiarize himself with these concepts. It is my belief that it will not be seen as regressive. In fact, a lot of people see it as progressive. They'll say, you mean to tell me that as a consumer, as someone who's poor, I have rights? That this person doesn't have the right to take advantage of me economically? It's a revolutionary concept today, it seems like. And we say, yes, of course, this is why the Prophet ﷺ, as we know, in Medina, lived the life of an ascetic man. He didn't live the life of a wealthy man. The reason why is he had the respect of everybody, and we all know this. In Medina, he is technically, de facto, de jure, the head of state. But he lives like the poorest person in Medina, so that the poor know that he is familiar with their plight. They know that this man, the Prophet ﷺ, understands me. He knew the lifestyle of the worst of Medina, and he could have had the best of it. This is why, right? So the example is very important. And in order to live that example, one must know what the example is, right? The more complex one would think a society is, the more we have to look at what is the solution that Islam is offering. And you will probably find that in a lot of instances actually quite progressive. I hope that answers the question. Why? Yep, brother.
Okay. Yeah. The question I was going to ask is the point that you've made in regards to advancing Islamic arguments through proofs and evidences. You know, like if we have a look at a lot of Western civilization, for example, if we take America as an example, and the immigration that took place there, and the subsequent killing of 160 million Red Indians, and how this was almost lost in history.
Mm-hmm.
And if we have a look at many examples of colonialism,
Yep.
There are major events that have completely been forgotten. And as much as I agree with your point about the strength of Islam being in presenting the correct argumentation with evidences, one can also conclude that there were aspects of the system, not the belief, but the system of Islam, where there was a certain degree of physical force. Okay. However, the after effect wasn't the same as what colonialism caused. And if you actually have a look at the people that were ruled, they would still be thankful to the initial people that brought or opened up a specific land for the scholars to come in, for that intellectual debate to take place.
Right.
So when the Orientalists present these arguments, why do you think they overlook their own sort of bloody history?
Okay.
Yeah? That's the question.
Being Canadian, so this accent isn't actually an East London accent. It's actually a Canadian accent. You made reference to the massacre of the indigenous populations. Now, I actually come from a place that, around my city, we have reservations. And growing up, for example, you are told in the classroom as a child something about their history. Whether it's true or false, you never know, because there's not one of them there in the classroom to contest the narrative. So if they're telling me something, I'm looking around me and I don't see any of them putting up their hands saying, no, actually, you know what, and you're right. For this reason, one of the reasons why they gloss over it is because what has happened is this separateness, this sort of apartheid between the indigenous populations of these areas and everybody else. If you were to ask a single, I don't know how many other Canadian speakers or American speakers you're expecting to have, but challenge them in the sense that, not in a negative sense, but if you ask them how many, the term you used as Indians or Red Indians, how many First Nations is, kind of like the politically correct term that they use, whatever the description, how many of them have you ever met? The answer probably is none, right? So I've never seen a family of them on the street. Never seen it. Not because they're not, they were ethnically cleansed, most definitely. You don't see it. And because you don't see it, what the Orientalist does is he brushes it under the rug. Who's going to challenge you? We limit the sort of information that's getting out. And now I think in the last part when I said, or towards the conclusion of my talk, when I said one has to not simply know our history as Muslims, but to know history more broadly, more generally. And I suppose I used a European example, but we can use this example as well. You have to first know the history of what happened in that area to be able to contest it. So, if I were to tell you that there was a delegation in 1902, before apartheid was implemented in South Africa, they came to Canada and they said, we want to know how you're able to keep these people separated and without there being any inconvenience upon the European population or those of European descent. How do you do it? And they said, this is how we do it. They taught them the system of racial pass laws. I didn't know that as a Canadian. I had to read that in a book about Palestine to know history of Canada. That gives you an idea of how good, the glossing over of these historical events has been. You don't see them with your, living there, you don't see them. So forget the history. You just simply can't have lunch with someone in your classroom and say, now tell me what happened to your family. And by the way, they had something called residential schools up until the 1980s, where they would tell these parents from these communities, you're not fit to raise children by virtue of the fact you're indigenous. So they would take the children away, give them new names, teach them a different culture. Happened until the 1980s. So someone who's maybe 10 years older than me would have been in such a school, as a matter of course. And this is part of the problem, right? Because history, the production of knowledge, part of that is also, Orwellian, right? You change the narrative, you change history. This is something else, this expression that Edward Said, I guess, uses, nations are narrations. You can always tell a power structure based on the narrative that they advance and how many people accept it. So equally, as you said, Islam, yeah, when it's, for example, whether it's the Ottomans or anyone else, in the act of conquering, was there violence involved? Absolutely. But as you said, it's paving the way, the scholars are coming, nobody's forced at that point. They're not saying, okay, accept Islam or die. That's not happening, because obviously you had non-Muslim minorities. We have, in a sense, had to own all of that, because we know how it's going to be spun. But we know what the narrative is in the West. This paragon of progression, technology, etc., etc. And because in some senses people have accepted that narrative. So that nation is that narration. So we need to know this for that reason. We need to know what happened to these populations. We need to confront them and say, let's not make this about us. Forget the history of Muslims. Your own history is blood-soaked, more, certainly more than ours. And it's not a competition of atrocity or anything like that. But of course, if someone tells you he's some sort of snake oil salesman, you have to call him on it, or her, and say, look, this is a complete nonsense, and here's why, right? The better you know that story, the better you are challenged. I hope that answers the question.
The brother with the scarf had a question.
Thinking about especially the first one when you mentioned about the Templar, that reminds me of a very good movie in the past, Physical. That story about how
Sure.
the people basically disobey the Catholic Church. But I just want to know if you can correct me about the other movement called Freemasonry.
Could I ask you to speak up just a
Yeah,
bit?
the other movement called Freemasonry, which is about the same time when the Templar returned from Crusade. And is it also try to separate from the church, from dominance of Catholic Church at the time? And also, I heard some of my friends, they have some idea, which I want you to comment, that the Freemasonry is linked intimately with the Zionism. Is it correct?
Okay. I'll try to make this quick, because in a sense, the whole Freemason thing is kind of going in a different direction from, I think, what we're discussing here. But To the extent that, and there's some talk that Scottish Rite Freemasonry is a descendant from the Knights Templar. So they go to Scotland, you know, wait it out basically because they're being hunted, and repackage themselves as Scottish Rite Freemasons as distinct from the Knights Templar, and some of the symbology and all of that. Some of the things and some of the conspiracy theories about Freemasonry is hard to know because it's secret. So they don't write books, you know, you're not meant to know what they're doing. It's just very difficult to know. I mean, as far as Freemasonry being connected to Zionism, not really. I mean, Zionism is sort of a very different and independent movement that starts in, you know, Theodor Herzl, 1896. And what Herzl is concerned about is he's just simply concerned that Europeans are infected with this notion of anti-Semitism and they can't be cleansed of it. And so the solution then is to move back, you know, to some sort of historical land. Never popularly received, by the way, so he ends up holding the first Zionist conference in Basel, in Switzerland, because in Vienna, where he's actually from, he was basically undoing the work of the Jewish community to be accepted in Europe. So this anti-Semitic trope that, okay, Jews look like you and talk like you, but they're not actually like you, all of these Jewish communities in Europe were saying, no, that's not true. Theodor Herzl undid and said, no, they're actually right. We don't belong in Europe. So Herzl basically had no connection, you know, to that. He was basically reacting to factors, and he was kind of crazy as well. I mean, if you read his diaries, he would say things like, for example, in the English version of his diary, you can get it online, which was first published in 1896, he says, if, for example, in this new Jewish state, first of all, they would all convert to Catholicism. So he said the Pope would preside over a mass conversion ceremony in the Stefanskirche in Poland and preside over this conversion of every Jew to Catholicism. And then at which point in this new Jewish state, if one Jew overcharged another Jew, they would solve that by having a duel. He was crazy, right? And there's very little doubt about that, not connected to Freemasonry. The United States, however, I think 70% of the signatories of the Declaration of Independence were Freemasons. And this isn't even hidden. So George Washington, when he goes to sign the Constitution, has the logo and the symbology of Freemasonry. Washington, D.C. is actually designed as a Freemasonic city. So if you were to see it from the air, you would see actually the symbolism very clearly. So it's quite interesting, but I think it might get outside the scope of our conversation. Maybe you and I can have a conversation about that, you know, separately. But Jazakallah khair, to an extent that answers it.
Just this brother.
I was thinking, because we had about 3 brothers asking if there's any among the sisters, just to kind of keep it balanced, who have questions. Yeah, then we can continue otherwise.
Speak up.
We can move on to the brothers and take one and we'll see.
Yes, brother.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that Orientalism from 200 years ago was a study of the East as one single unit from Morocco to India,
Right.
and how it was intertwined with colonialism in order to civilize the savages of the East. But it seems that that policy never really stopped because, as you know, after the end of the Soviet Union and the demise of communism, there were a whole load of studies and initiatives. One in Europe, which the Europeans agreed on, which became known as the Middle East Partnership. The American version was a Greater Middle East Initiative, which was eventually endorsed in 2004. And we see that the Greater Middle East Initiative had exactly the same goals as Orientalism and colonialism right from its start, in terms of attacking Islam, putting it on the defensive, and trying to liberate the savages of the East. And we see, and would you agree that all the recent policies that we've seen, such as the invasion of Iraq, the current carnage taking place in the Middle East, in which the colonialists, and frankly America, is backing all sides, whether it is the rebel groups of supposedly an Islamic nature or a nationalist nature, or whether it's the regimes, but the carnage which is resulting is in order to demonize Islam, or demonize the other, as you're explaining it, so that the Muslims themselves may detach themselves from Islam and hand America an easy victory in order for the Muslims to embrace secularism with all its various concepts, so they can put this 200-year war or 300-year war to bed once and for all. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, and as you say, again, the civilizing mission, to a certain extent, certain operative terms and buzzwords get replaced, right? So, For example, if we were to say in the 19th century it's spreading Christianity, you know, the white man's burden, that's Rudyard Kipling would have put it, is to spread Christianity. Now we think about, you know, we replace Christianity with democracy. Again, as a term, most of the people that peddle this probably don't even know the meaning of the word itself. It's this very subtle transition. First of all, to make it palpable to public opinion back home that this is what we're doing, and so we don't have interference from an electorate. But yeah, I mean, when you look at in the recent history, I would say, you know, since in the last 20 or 30 years, absolutely. So we have these terms that circulate. For example, Islamism, or recently in this recent counterterrorism and security bill, this idea of non-violent extremism. Now when you look at that, you're thinking, well, what is an extremist? It's actually someone, what makes someone extreme is their likelihood to resort to violence. So then you can't really say there's such a thing as a non-violent extremist, because what is an extreme idea? If I say, well, you know, 2,000 years ago there was a prophet in Palestine who walked on water and raised the dead, someone might say, well, that means that you have to suspend the physical operation of the laws of physics or the physical universe. That's an extreme idea. What it's really aimed at is whether you call it a moderate Muslim or Islamism. You use all of these terms, absolutely, to try and disconnect the Muslim from their religion. So what is a moderate Muslim? It's someone who only believes in Islam moderately, right? So too much is a bad thing, you know, only in moderation. Don't pray 5 times a day, you know, moderate, pray 2, you know, maybe combine them, pray 3 and call it a day. So yeah, it's this idea that, and it also does create this whether you want to call it self-doubt, insecurity. Someone says, well, yeah, apparently we need to adopt these concepts of, I want to be free, you know, whatever that means, you know, in some very oblique sense. We need more, you know, Allah Adam, I mean, again, this reference to, we need democracy the way that the United States has democracy, or the way that any other place has it. Whether that is fitting in that way for any given place would be, at best, a contestable proposition. But yeah, a lot of this is aimed at a propagandistic level, right? So to get the Muslim, to demonize the Muslim in relation to Islam, right? So that the emulation is, and you see this all the time, because a decent example, when you see these, for example, Arab dictators and other things, because they don't actually understand how power works, what they do is they emulate those in power, right? So for example, if I were to see you build a car, you know, from top to bottom in the engineering campus here or something, and I don't actually know what makes the car run. I don't know that that's the engine or the light or, you know, I don't know, the seat belt. I'm forced to build the entire car the way that you do, because I don't actually know it's the engine that pushes the car. So in the same way, we have a lot of people who don't understand this, and so they feel, if I emulate this person in everything that they do, I will have what they have, right? So in an attempt to replicate patterns of power, this is what happens. And so the West realizes this, or, you know, America realizes this, Britain realizes this. So what they do is it's called soft power, right? Convince them that Islam is the problem. If they do everything as we do it, they'll be fine. No problem. You know, they'll succeed, they'll flourish. This is the issue. And of course, one could say that this is the new Orientalism, is soft power, as practiced by, you know, the United States and Britain. I don't know if that answers the question, or if
to some extent,
Okay.
I was more thinking of the fact that, I know you call it soft power, but it's a lot more hard considering how much effort and energy they've put into invade Iraq, to engineer the Arab Spring, to
Right.
engineer the civil war that's taking place in the Middle East right now,
Right.
to demonize Islam through these black
Yep.
flag waving people who
Right.
just suddenly appear out of nowhere. America can chokehold Russia and sanction them, but this group which just emerges on back of trucks out of nowhere,
Right.
they can export oil on the black market. I mean, it's very, you know, clear that this is more of an ideological and geopolitical thing in order to try to keep the Middle East in turmoil permanently,
Right.
and to prevent the rise of an Islamic civilization, of a real Islamic state, because we'll be so embarrassed. You say to the average person now, what do you think about Islamic State? After all the propaganda they've seen, no one wants to mention it. It'll become like the IS word. It's something we don't talk about.
Right, right.
But there is something called a real Islamic State, which Muslims do aspire to, but But this whole Greater Middle East initiative is
Right.
geared towards eradicating this idea from the minds of Muslims
Right.
in order to end this 200-year civilizational war, which you mentioned.
Right, and I think, and that's not to say when I mention soft power, I'm not saying that soft power being exercised in the absence of hard power. Because hard power is obviously, when we're talking about military, aggressive, coercive diplomacy, etc., very clear that that's all happening. But I think what they've realized is hard power in the absence of soft power, it isn't enough anymore to just, for example, blow up a city and leave it at that. Right? That would be just pure hard power without the exercise of soft power. Soft power is this idea that you have to make a cultural idea or a religious idea or something connected to identity, ideology, as repulsive. You know, and that person has to see it as repulsive. So if the Muslim begins to see Islam as repulsive, that's soft power. If the Muslim is simply told, well, look, renounce your faith or I'll kill you, and people are saying, all right, well, kill me, and they kill them, ideologically, it doesn't work, right? Because, again, you meet with this resistance. So it's this hand-in-glove operation of hard power together with soft power. And I think the movements that you're talking about that have risen since, you know, the early 90s is realizing, because this is what the United States realized after the Cold War, is we need to inject more soft power into this new conflict. Because that's something that they couldn't do with the Soviet Union. They tried towards the end with initiatives like Radio Free Europe, which is really aimed at the Soviet ideology. And now they're taking those lessons and they're really exercising soft power in combination with hard power. And you're seeing that, I think, in lockstep. And yes, you know, in a lot of ways, this is the ultimate goal. I think you got it right in terms of your analysis and your conclusion. Absolutely.
I think the brother with the great top.
A question very much linked to this topic is whether Islam and modernity is whether Islam is compatible with quote-unquote modern Western society.
Right.
And you know, what my take would be no, because I know for a very good reason, in the sense that in Western society, a lot of their societal values comes from the root of secularism, the separation of religion from life.
Right.
So values such as democracy, liberalism, free speech is man-made. It comes from man.
Right.
But as a Muslim, my values comes from my Creator, Allah, because I know Allah created me, so He knows what's best for me.
Right.
So I take Sharia as my values. So actually, I will never be compatible with Western society as a whole. I can live here.
Right.
I can live my life as a Muslim to the best of my ability. But I will never be able to integrate and assimilate with this society, because my values will never be the same as a non-Muslim who takes his values from man rather than the Creator. What would your take be on this?
Yeah, I mean, if by modernity, right, we simply mean, if we're to place modernity with contemporary, or contemporariness, right, like today, just simply living in the modern world. In some ways, a person can try and detach that from secularism, but you're right, secularism is a product of the modern world, right? It is a relatively recent introduction, right, coming from the Enlightenment. Now, to a certain extent, you're right. And there are certain times when things like, let's say, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, you know, certain ideas that come from secularism, if you take, Allah commands something, therefore that's it for me. I don't need any other reference point. I don't need to explain why. I don't need to understand, I guess the term would be the illa, right? Otherwise, what you end up doing, of course, then you take the Mu'tazila approach, right, which is trying to understand this. So, whether or not the question of Islamic values, it seems that there is an attempt to demonize it, to suggest that secularism is the only way. And of course, as Muslims, for the most part, we reject this idea that you can separate. Notice at the beginning of Islam, right? So Hamza tells the Prophet ﷺ, the first thing he does when he says, I'm a Muslim, right? When Hamza does this and he confronts the Quraysh, he tells the Prophet ﷺ, and at least this in Ibn Hisham's Sirah, he says, when I'm out hunting, especially at night because he was an avid hunter, he says, the one thing I know is that Allah is not confined to the home, right? Like the Quraysh would worship idols and they leave it there, they check everything at the door and they leave. He said, I know Allah is not in the home. He's not confined to the home. So as Muslims, equally, when I walk out of my house, I don't say, okay, I leave Islam there, now I separate it. Like when I'm having this conversation with you, my morals, my ethics, my values, everything, I can't separate it. And Islam doesn't seek to do this. It's when you use, for example, when you use the washroom, Islam commands you what you're doing, right? When you get married, when you sleep, you hear lightning, Islam tells you everything, right? So in the Quran it says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says we've left nothing out of this book. It's come to deal with every single one, right? So whether or not you cannot reconcile it with secularism, this I would agree. Whether or not Islam has a place in the modern world, I would say it's more desperately needed than ever in the modern world, right? Because of this direction. And you look at the problems as a result. You and I realize, okay, if Allah created you in a certain way and He tells you, He gives you the manual, you can say, you don't follow it, what do you think is going to happen, right? So when you look at the problems society faces, you know, it probably doesn't come as a surprise to a lot of us that, okay, of course, if you're going to embrace secularism, yeah, you're going to have a lot of problems. And we see that, right? So, and nor should you have to make that decision anyways. You should have every right to say, and you do, in my view, to say, look, I'm a Muslim, I reject this, I take my values from Islam, from the Sharia, etc., etc., and why you don't need to assimilate. You know, assert that right, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree, but I think what the problem is, today, living here, if you say you reject freedom of speech, you reject democracy and liberalism, you know, it doesn't go down well.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
they claim universality to it.
Right, yeah.
It's a value that the whole world should accept, but actually it's not.
Okay, so here's what we need to do, I think. So for example, and this is why there needs to be a certain wisdom in the approach at the same time, right? So, for example, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad, right? So, if now someone says, do you believe in freedom of speech? Again, look at the assumption of the question. First of all, it assumes that the person asking you believes in it, first of all. And you say, no, I don't. It's a kuffar value. Let's say that's how you phrase it. You're like, okay. Well, you're thinking, you don't believe in freedom of speech. What are you talking about? You know, it's a myth. So, nobody believes in it. Who actually advances this idea that you could say whatever you want, right? It doesn't exist. Here's what Islam says. So you have to clarify, because keep in mind that the person asking you, now you don't know if the person asking you the question, it's because they're ignorant genuinely, or they have an agenda, right? Allahu alam, it could be either. But now if you assume that's because they don't know, they might think that Islam literally restricts what you can talk about. Like you can talk about one or two things and that's it. You know, why are you talking about Orientalism? This isn't in the Quran and the Sunnah, Orientalism. You can't have the conversation. It's not true. So you, first of all, for the non-Muslim, because you're giving them dawah, you're saying, look, you're thinking that Islam is overtly, you know, restrictive, and it's not. You can have a conversation. If I ask you, you know, what's your favorite meal? Is that prohibited to ask you this? No basis in the Quran and the Sunnah, right? So you have to understand that if it's accidental, it's because a lot of people think Islam is, you can only talk about 2 or 3 things. So if you just come out and say, yeah, you know, you kuffar, I don't know what you're doing, this freedom of speech, yeah, I reject this as a Muslim, you need to unpack it, you need to, first of all, neither do you. So let's discuss, what does Islam allow? Because I think Islam doesn't allow anything. Now if you say, here's the truth about Islam, now obviously, if you insult my prophet, I'm going to be offended. If you insult his mother, you mean to tell me he's not going to be offended, right? So you say, look, I'm offended. Doesn't mean I'm going to kill you, but I need to explain to you why. Do you know anything about the Prophet ﷺ? Probably doesn't. So if you believe that someone who's familiar with the Prophet ﷺ will not slander him in such a way, I mean, now certain people are misguided. You can give them all the dawah. Allah guides who He wills and misguide who He wills, right? But right? Quran says, فَذَكِّرْ إِنَّمَا أَنْتَ مُذَكِّرْ. Remind, you're only a reminder. You're not over them, a controller of their affairs, right? Tell them the truth, understand what the question is asking, rather than simply the reaction. Use that wisdom and say, well, you don't believe this either. It's a myth. Freedom of speech, the way they peddle it is a myth. So you don't believe it, we don't do it. No problem. Neither of us agree with it. So, you know, tell them it's irrelevant, doesn't exist, and then move on, and then, you know, frame the question yourself. Right? Better to be speaking from your toes than from your heels, right? Offensive rather than defensive.